over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. The drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer. Send the word.
Hey y'all, welcome to another Mr. Johnson video. Today I'm going to be presenting through the projector because this is a big deal about the causes of World War I. So, for World War I, there's an acronym we usually use to describe it, but overall, all the things that combine to cause World War I isn't just a single event, like we're used to, like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It's a lot more complex than that, and things over time really add up to create the situation for a war. And so the first one, once I find a marker, I believe it's the teacher probably took it. All right, so the first one is called militarism. Yep, I know. You're impressed because my handwriting is not horrible as it usually is. So for militarism, the one thing to really understand is everyone was building new technology. As we talked about already with the imperialism in Africa particularly, the machine guns was starting to be used by Europeans, and its devastating impact meant that there was more and more investment in a model for a machine gun. So the machine guns were used up. They started developing, the American Civil War did do something to world history in terms of military history. It's the first time two metal ships ever fought one another. And when that happened, all wooden boats basically became obsolete. Because if you think about it, metal cannonball going into wood is a lot less effective than is more effective than going into metal. And so overnight, realizing that metal boats could actually float, that this is going to change naval warfare. And the increasing development of artillery means that artillery shells can go from, in the Civil War era, shooting something like maybe a mile away, even though mostly it was accurate within a half a mile, to multiple miles. These are the age of the dreadnoughts and these huge boats that could fire very long distances. It'll get so crazy that by World War II, most naval actions that involve large ships like battleships, they don't actually see their targets. They're firing from distance because they have an idea of where they're firing and indiscriminate fire and all that. So the militarism, though, is the budgets of these countries, they started really investing in their military. Artillery, machine guns, the Germans and the English were having this arms race towards boats because the English have always been superior as a navy, and now that there's a new navy that their old boats don't always work, they've had to upgrade over time, and they've had a pretty good shot of it, having steam engine boats that started with the Opium Wars, but then developing these dreadnoughts, these new class of warfare of ships that were dangerous. And the Americans had their own fleet, the Russians lost their White Fleet in 1905 to the Japanese. So militarism is becoming a great concern because there's so much military. Like, if you have a bunch of these toys, people want to use them. And so that's really the concern, is that everyone's gearing up their military to show who's more powerful, means they're looking to use it and use it on each other. So the next one is alliances. And this is where there's a crazy entanglement of multiple alliances. And that's what we're going to show you on another piece of paper that looks super crazy. I stole this from Wikipedia because it's that good, like it explains everything. So let's flip your page just for a second, and we'll look at that.
You have loved lots of girls in the sweet long ago, and each one has meant heaven to you. You have vowed your affection to each one in turn, and have sworn to them all you'd be true. You have kissed 'neath the moon while the world seemed in tune, then you've left her to hunt a new game. Does it ever occur to you later, my boy, that she's probably doing the same? I wonder who's kissing her now, wonder who's teaching her now, wonder who's looking into her eyes, breathing sighs, telling lies. I wonder who's buying the wine for lips that I used to call mine.
Okay, want to see something fun? Here is the graph on entanglement of alliances. And yes, it really gets this messy. And so the way to look at it, though, is the political situation prior to World War I. Germany becomes a country in 1870. And all of a sudden, you now have all these little principalities that are one large nation that becomes the center of Europe and is probably one of the most populous and most economically well-off and industrialized nations. All of a sudden, they go from basically being a bunch of small stuff to being one of the largest, if not the guy in charge in Europe. And it changes all the power structures in Europe. So what happens? France, next to Germany, gets worried. And so France decides that, to show you the map, if we have like a little map of Europe here, because we're going to be super cool with our art, and Mr. J's a genius and also an artist. All right, we got Denmark and all that. And there we got Italy. Cool. So yeah, really terrible Italy. I don't care about your feelings. So we got all of that going on, and then we got a little England and Ireland, because we got to remember the Irish. All right, of course they're not going to be watching this time. So we got France, and France is really scared with Germany being right next to them. They've always had wars, and the last war they fought in 1870 was against the Germans, and that's what causes the Germans to actually become Germany. They declare a war on an outside enemy in the southern part of Germany. Switzerland, Germany, here we go, Austria, whatever. Okay, cool. So the southern part of Germany, Bavaria, joins up with the rest of Germany and becomes the German Empire. So France is worried. So France decides that the best way to make sure that Germans don't go after them is to make an alliance. With whom? With Russia. And at this point, Germany actually looks more like this. It's going into a little Poland a little bit, and Russia comes all the way and touches them. Because there's no Poland. Poland gets partitioned 3 times in its history. Why? Because it's a flat land that anyone can take over. There's no defensible boundaries, lots of people, and flat. So it's easy to be conquered. And Poland, yeah. In fact, the reason why there's so many Polish Jews at this time period is that the Russians set up an exclusion zone for Jews. So the Jews could only live in non-Russian land, and Poland was one of those major areas. That was set up for later when the Germans invade. There's so many Polish Jews because of how Russia put Jews, or solved their Jewish problem, which is the term they used for the Holocaust and all these awful things. So anyway, I know. So we got France. And they create an alliance with Russia in 1894. And worried about Germany, they also create an alliance with Great Britain in 1904. And Britain eventually signs a treaty with Russia to create an alliance here. And they call this the Triple Alliance. So, oops, I forgot to write Britain and Russia. Now, in most of German history, Germany loses when they fight a multiple front war. Whether it was, say, the 30 Years' War, remember about where like 1/3 of all Germans died? You had French fighting the Swedes, and then the Russians coming in, as well as the Austrians, as a complete mess. So they don't want that to happen. Then you had wars of Frederick the Great and some of those things, where you had France and Russia coming in. In fact, Frederick the Great thought he was going to lose as 3 different empires armies were coming in on Prussia, which was early Germany. And then the Tsar, I think it was Catherine the Great, died. And her successor was actually friends with Frederick the Great and immediately pulled out of the war. And then the France was like, and Austria were like, whoa, dude, bro, that's not cool. And they're like, fine, we're not doing this too, because that's not cash money. And so they left. And yes, I say cash money just to be really annoying. Anyway, they pull out. That's called the Hohenzollern miracle, because Frederick the Great's last name is Hohenzollern. That'll come up later if I ever bring up that story too, because anyway. Moving on. So Germany over here, Russia. So Germany's worried too. And so they choose to have an alliance with an empire they actually fought. One of the first wars Germany goes to is against Austria-Hungary. Whoa, okay, this is what, Germany. And all they did when they defeated Austria-Hungary in a war was tell them, let's be friends, but you can't come into Germany anymore. And Austria-Hungary's like, that's good enough for us. And so they made this treaty in 1879. So as much as it seems like a war, it really was kind of just, they fought it out so that Germany can create a state and have Austria outside of German affairs. And it's one of the things we look at, and especially about after World War I, there's two types of peace. There is a mutual and friendly peace, Germany and Austria-Hungary, or a Carthaginian peace. A Carthaginian peace is when the Romans got peace from the Carthaginians by destroying Carthage. It's the only other way, really. The peace is either both sides agree and are okay, or you destroy the other side. There's no in between. And Treaty of Versailles is going to be an example of what not to do. So there's your little foreboding warning as well. Now, Austria-Hungary, also near Italy, decides they're going to create a peace treaty in 1882, and also with Germany in 1882. They call this the Triple Entente. Now, when the war starts, it's going to be called the Central Powers. But right now, it's not. The war isn't started. There's these alliances. But Germany now realizes the only way they're going to be safe, if you have enemies here, here, and here, to stop any kind of multi-front war, is to secure Austria-Hungary here and Italy there. So at least Central Europe has two fronts, and you can have two sides rather than surrounded. That was at least their idea. And then you have the Ottomans down here. The problem is, when war starts out, Italy doesn't go with them. Spoiler alert. Now, here's the next problem. Russians believe that they are the heirs and the safeguards of all Slavic peoples. So if you speak Russian or any Cyrillic alphabet, you are a descendant of the same people as the Russians, and they are going to be the empire that represents the Slavs. And that empire is a small little country called Serbia. And the other Balkan empire down here is called Bulgaria. Now, they're going to have some issues, but at the same point, Austria-Hungary goes to Sarajevo, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand goes to Sarajevo to check out something or whatever. There's so many good stories I'm going to tell you in a few minutes. But what did you do?
I don't know what I pressed.
Oh well, let's have fun with this. So, in this mess, did the computer shut down?
No, it's still up.
There we go. That's exactly what I wanted to do. So, this would be the Ottoman Empire. Now they join and become the Central Powers in 1914. And Italy will then join the alliance. So what happens next? After the assassination, Austria-Hungary says Serbia, the Serb killed them. They killed the Crown Prince of Austria. And Serbia says, look, dudes, sorry, that wasn't our guy. He's in your country. And Austria-Hungary says, we get to bring in our police, and we need to go in there and get your guy. And at first, Serbia's like, no, we can find him. And Austria says, if you don't do this, we're going to go to war. Serbia is like, okay, fine. But Germany's already riled up, like, we're going to go ahead and defend our ally, Austria-Hungary. And Serbia's sitting here going like, hey, Russia, remember how we're friends? And so all of this is going on. They can't find Gavrilo Princip and his other group. And eventually it turns into, on, of course, all days, my birthday, I believe it is, July 25, 1914. Hey, just for fun, look up Germany declaring war on Russia in 1914. I believe it's my birthday. It's either that or... And what happens then is, when Germany declares war on Russia, they activate all their alliances. And that starts all of World War I. But little alliances here, they activate their alliances. This one breaks, this one comes up. And now you have all of Europe.
They were summoned from the hillside, they were called in from the glen, and the country found them ready at the stirring call for men. Let no tears add to their hardships as the soldiers pass along, and although your heart is breaking, make it sing this cheery song. Keep the home fires burning while your hearts are yearning, though your lads are far away, they dream of home.
So, the next major deal, there's two ways of teaching this, and I was preparing for one of them, and then I realized my pictures are out of order. How did I do this? And then I was like, oh, that's right. We're going to put N here. Oh, no, I'm not. We're actually doing... Oh, yeah. No, we're good. Sorry. The next one's imperialism. I'm sure you've heard about this already. All last unit, we had some classes on it. We did, activity. But they were carving up Africa. So here's a picture of the Berlin Conference. But the other one for this was that Germany was seeking overseas territories. Everyone else had a good cut. But the Germans, who are now powerful and strong in Central Europe, they felt they deserved their own colonies. Just because they were a late start doesn't mean they shouldn't have access to major resources throughout the world, especially if they have the weaponry and the civilian population to back them up, that they should have a cut, or they could go to war. And so there's this jealousy against France and England, particularly for their overseas empires that are feeding them all kinds of troops, or eventually it'll be troops, but resources as well. Another thing about World War I, as much as we say, well, isn't a world war if it just fought in Europe? Except the people that manned these trenches and fought in these battles, there was over 1 million troops from India alone. Anzacs had their own battle in Gallipoli. That was a major catastrophic failure. But there were more battles than were just Europe. There was the Ottoman Empire, the British and the Ottoman Empire, and the Arab Revolt at the same time. There's all things going on. So anyway, imperialism is going to actually save Britain in both world wars. But for right now, it's more or less the jealousy of Germany and the empires of France and Britain that are really causing the tensions in Europe. And then lastly, it's nationalism for Maine. And it's with this nationalism, this belief system, that people should rule their own country. So if you are, Bulgarian, you should have your own country. If you're Romanian, you should have your own country. There are a lot of ethnic groups, particularly like Yugoslavia is one example, where it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but there's like Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, all of these places that had their semblance of self-rule. Not to mention the Balkans is quite bumpy. I mean, like I say bumpy, but like it was hilly. So there was very much isolated populations. So it wasn't a very easy place to rule. And all of this is pictured here as an aging Otto von Bismarck, the chief architect of uniting Germany. The big concern for him, and one of his famous quotes is, the next major war is going to be caused by some damn fool thing in the Balkans. And this southern part of Europe, the Balkans, is exactly what's going to happen, which is going to cause the letter S, the spark. And I'm not making references to The Last Jedi because that movie was trash, but in this case, the spark is the assassination of Archduke, or Crown Prince basically, Franz Ferdinand. Even another fun fact, not only was the car that he was assassinated unlucky, so was the attempt to assassinate the Archduke. This group called the Black Hand were a bunch of Serbian militants who got together and planned this attack. And he was visiting, I think, like a hospital or some other place, and they were all set up to attack him and ambush them when they tried to throw a grenade and missed and failed. So they're all sad that their assassination plot didn't go right, and they're walking home away from town when Because of that, they decided to take another route, and they took a wrong turn, right to where the Black Hand and Gabriel Princip was. And literally, they stopped right in front of the assassin, and he's sitting there going, okay. And he sits up, and he shoots the Archduke and his wife, killing them both. Another interesting thing, because sometimes Reddit is cool for super nerds, and I don't know if I've really flashed my nerd potential or my credentials yet, but like, yeah, I'm nerdy and I read history for fun, surprise. One of the cool ass historian questions was, did Gabriel Princip really feel bad for the war that he caused by having the spark start? And he basically said, frankly, I didn't start this war. I was stopping these guys from basically taking over my land. We should have had our independence. Now, he actually dies in prison in the 1920s, but even some of the other guys, one of them survives in the 1960s for an interview. But once again, interviewing someone in the 1960s about what happened in 1914, you got to realize a lot of stuff had gone down. World War I, Worldwide Depression, rise of fascism, World War II, end of World War II, Soviet occupation. So the guy can really say, like, I don't know if, like, I'm going to cause myself for all the events of the war, but, like, they can cleanly say, like, this isn't on me just because everyone's went to war over all this stupid stuff. So anyway, that's the breakdown of the start of World War I. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of the map of the actual places you need to know, as well as places you need to know, and then post-war environment. So here we go.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Home for the right turn, how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what will be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. What? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Come for us, retard, we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Come to the cookhouse door, boys, sniff at the lovely stew. Oh, as it says the colonel gets better grub than you. Any complaints this morning? Do we complain? Not we. What's the matter with lumps of onion floating around your tea? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley has gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. Rats. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, wasn't once in eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Oh, for the right turn, how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Lovely war. Be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley has gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up till the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Come for us, retard, how can we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
All right, so the battles of World War I. There aren't many to really talk about because really it becomes a full front assault in France and then battles of maneuver and all kinds of stuff over here. But we do need to go over the major powers. We got Great Britain, and believe it or not, Ireland becomes basically, they support Britain, but Irish 1916 go in revolt, and they actually start a very effective revolt by 1918, and a complete mess that they're really not participating as much as Britain would like. You got France. If you didn't know this was France, then Italy. Switzerland's neutral. Then we got the German Empire, and we're gonna call it the German Empire because at this time period, that's how they were represented, and that was one of the things to show, like, this might be Germany, but it was an empire that they were trying to expand. And then we got Russia, and Russia at this time period, its capital was here in St. Petersburg. And then we got Austria-Hungary. The Ottomans. And then down here we got Serbia and Bulgaria. And anything else we need? Okay, Belgium. Now, of all fun things to bring about Belgium is when Napoleon invaded Belgium in his second advance, when he in 1915 to start the Battle of Waterloo, which is in Belgium. The Belgians destroyed the entire land and filled it in with a huge statue of a golden lion facing France, saying, "You'll never invade us from that direction ever again." The sad part is they're correct. The other sad part is, by destroying the topography, you kind of lose the whole feel of what the battle looked like at the time of Waterloo, which for us who are Civil War nerds and looking at the battlefield that way, you're losing a lot of understanding of how the battle went down. The other irony then, of course, being the next two invasions of Belgium come from Germany. So, the battles. What goes down? The Germans realize they need to do something fast. So their first plan is to attack. Now the French kind of knew that these mountainous areas would be relatively fortified, so they invade through Belgium. And eventually they hit the Somme, and it's called the March to the Sea. And then they go all the way to the mountains. And this becomes the Western Front. And the first battle here is the Somme. There's actually 3 major battles along the Somme. So there's the Somme. Then over here, Germany also realizes they need a quick victory against Russia because otherwise they're fighting 2 fronts and they can't hold up. Also, keep in mind, the German forces at this time period, they were strong and well-disciplined military force. They were worrisome. The French actually were quite a strong military force. The British only had what was called an expeditionary force. The British army was not a major army in this war, nor in most wars. Yes, they geared up, but as a standing army, Britain never really had that many of soldiers. They had a sizable navy. The Hungarians, though, however, and Austria and whatnot, their military forces were not the most effective, nor was Russia. Russia had already lost the Crimea. They tried to fix things, and that didn't work too well. And in 1905, they got in a war with the Japanese and lost their entire Western fleet. In fact, it was so bad, they sailed their Sevastopol fleet from the Black Sea all the way around Africa and into basically the Korean Peninsula to fight the Japanese and lose again. So they were incredibly embarrassed by this war. So what happens here is the Germans, the Somme was started in 1914, as well as the Battle of Tannenberg. Within some time, I forget how long the battle lasts, the Germans are able to encircle and surround over 1 million Russian soldiers, and they surrender. And this leaves a gap here for the Germans basically to maneuver and defeat the Russians wherever they see fit. And the guy who's in charge of this will actually, he'll come into play later. His name was Baron von Hindenburg. And him and another general, both of them are going to be famous in the post-war era. And Hindenburg will be president of Germany when he decides to agree to let Hitler run as chancellor. So there are some fronts that start here between Italy and Austria-Hungary. There is a war of maneuver that with light front, but not like trench like this part area over here. Then the British with the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Auxiliary Corps, invade to put a front over here to try to threaten the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, as well as threat and supply Russia through the Black Sea instead of coming up here in the frozen. And this is the Battle of Gallipoli. If you want a terrible movie, it's Mel Gibson's first movie. If you don't know who that is, he's done a lot of cool, famous movies that are old, but he's also super racist and misogynist, so that doesn't age well either. This battle was it was one of the first amphibious invasions, and it was a huge disaster over time, to the point where they had to completely pull out by 1916. So the war wages on. Another battle in 1916 is Verdun, where over 1 million people are killed in a series of 4 months. This area alone of France is still a hot zone for unexploded artillery ordnance and gas. So it's actually areas that are not allowed to be patrolled in, and they every now and then try to find other explosives and ordnance to explode. But it hasn't been as frequent anymore because it's obviously over 100 years old. But it's ranging right now about 1 death every 10 years in France to unexploded ordnance from World War I in these areas. So if you look it up, there's actually a very nasty cost of life, even post-war environment. But anyway,
frightful First World War.
This is there's the Battle of Jutland. This was a naval battle between the British and the Germans. Boop boop. There's a boat. But other than that, the Germans tried to create a blockade of Great Britain with their U-boats. U-boats are submarines. What major invention that we take so much for granted, as I'm filming this on my phone right now, is one example. And anyone want to guess that invention? And I'm going to have wait time just to see if any of you guess it. So speak like it's Dora and you can ask. No, I won't do it. But anyway, anyone got a guess? It's actually the battery. Because these U-boats in this time period, what they could do is they basically were these metal hulls that could go underwater for a short time. But they could run on steam power through coal, recharge the battery, and then submerge when they see another smokestack. And they could basically approach. This isn't the World War II boats that could go underwater for a long period of time. They would scout and they'd go underwater. What will eventually happen to cause the United States involvement is, one, there's a boat sinking here in 1915 called the Lusitania. Now, it had Americans on board, something like 200 to 300. But here's the thing. The Germans, when they sunk the Lusitania, the boat goes boom, boom, and then goes down within 20 minutes. Now, the Americans and the British were like, you just hit a passenger boat, dude. That's way uncool. Germans are like, no, there's munitions on it. How did it blow up twice? You only shot 1 torpedo. And like Americans and the British were like, nah, man, you're full of it, because the Americans are neutral. They're not in war right now. The Germans are like, we know how many bombs there were. We only shot 1 and 2 bombs go up. So this happened all the way till 1996 or 1998, where the British government finally said, oh yeah, by the way, there was guns and ammunition actually on it that the Americans were selling us. 70 years later, do they admit to it? Like, that's how kept of a secret it was. But yes, the United States was realizing that it's the best chance for them was to supply the British with munitions and some material, which is against the rules of war, which means we are already engaged in somewhat of a war. But anyway, the German unrestricted submarine warfare, this is kind of a cool little story too. The U-boats, as a policy, would submerge. They got in trouble for just shooting ships and blowing them up. So they decided that, hey, let's tell you we're going to sink you. So they surface and they go, hey, transport ship, we're going to blow you up. The transport ship's like, oh my God! And they get on their passenger ships and all that stuff, and they get on the lifeboats, and then they torpedo the boat with the material and all goes in the bottom. Well, everyone realized if they're going to announce it, let's put a deck gun on the boat. Now keep in mind, these floating little U-boats were not that strong. If they got hit, they're done. So they would be like, yo, we're going to sink you. And all of a sudden, you see this 4 to 6 inch gun start turning and pow, put a hole in the boat and sinks it. The Germans like, dude, we were telling you, we were giving you notice. That's not cool. And they're like, come and sink us now, buddy. And then the Germans are like, we're not going to tell you next time, buddy. And that's exactly what happened, is that the Germans started not telling anyone again. And the Americans were like, they're going back to unrestricted warfare. They're just going to hit anything. That's illegal. And yet the whole story is they were trying to be nice. And the other side, I'm not saying the Germans are right. This is war. But I'm just saying, both sides look at it. Now, what's one of the final straws? The Germans sent a telegram to Mexico and saying, hey, Mexico, remember how the Americans beat you 60 or 70 years ago in the Mexican-American War and took some of your land? we'll allow you to get it all back if you open a front against the Americans. And the Americans intercepted it and then published it in the papers. And the United States was not too happy with this. And so in 1917, they declared war on Germany. And the problem was, it wasn't the Americans coming in that was going to change the course of the war. It was a brand new country with, unaffected by war after 4 to 5 years of fighting. 3 years. But you're talking casualties of insane amounts. The French troops were so done with the frontal warfare, they would not advance anymore. They were in complete mutiny. We will defend our land, and we're going to stay in our trenches, but we are not going forward because you're butchering us. The British were pulling in troops from all over the world. So were the French. So you had Indians and Africans and all other groups from all over the world in these trenches because they were running out of people. And then the Americans show up, and everyone's like, whoa, 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 whoa. It's like playing a sport against someone, and all of a sudden they bring in like a ringer. Well, we weren't that much of a ringer then, but they bring in a fresh dude. All of a sudden, it's like, that's not part of the game. He was never on the team at the beginning. Well, now they are. And we show up, and being American and bravado and stuff, we're a little bit crazy. Like, people don't realize the American like spirit and stuff, like our Marines, and that's where they get the Devil Dog. I forget what it's called, the something Funden, but the Germans call the Marines Devil Dogs because they just didn't retreat. And people were like, why didn't they retreat? That makes no sense. And it was like, America. And that's one of the threats that the Germans realized, that by 1917 and then 1918 is when troops start showing up. That's going to be the major threat that they cannot counter. No matter what's all going on over here, they could not hold and realize they could not stop what the Americans were about to bring. And so by the late 1918, they decided, okay, let's talk about a peace treaty. And that's going to start at Versailles. So.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below, we are the dead short days ago. We lived the dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields, in Flanders fields, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up your quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow. In Flanders fields, in Flanders fields, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow. In Flanders fields, in Flanders fields.
Okay, Treaty of Versailles. In 1918 to 1919, they were negotiating the Treaty of Versailles in Paris, right outside. And at this point, the Allies were seeing themselves as victorious, as Germany was the first ones to sue for peace. Now, on this side, however, the Germans and the Russians have already sued for peace in the Treaty of, I think it's called Brest-Litovsk, where the Russians basically concede quite a bit of land to the Germans, and it was quite nasty what it did. But it knocked the Russians out of the war. Why? Because this was also where you have the Russian Revolution. And this will completely change this situation over here. We're not going to talk about that yet. That's going to come up much later. I read a whole book about the fall of the empire from 1900 to 1919, so I know a bit about it, but I'll spare you because that 20 hours of an audiobook is not something we need to bring up right now, and I'm already talking too much about it. So anyway, the Germans, though, they didn't have to worry too much about the Russians at this point. They knocked them out of the war. Ottomans had been failing against the Russians anyway. It was so bad that out here, the Ottoman Empire, basically their leading general in the army just got up and left one day. Like, he just straight up quit. Like, he was done with fighting against these Russians and stuff. So it was looking pretty bad over here. This was still just a mess, but over here the war was just really winding down, and casualty, like at both sides, everyone was exhausted from it. And so with some ramifications, Wilson coming in as this hero for democracy, trying to promote everybody, the freedom of the seas, and some of this was called the 17 points. And some of them will be adopted, such as the League of Nations, which is a precursor to the UN, but also a right to have individual countries rule themselves. People should rule themselves, and we should stop having empires. And that doesn't so much work in the rest of the world, but it does break up Europe. First off, you have Poland. That becomes a country. This is East Prussia. That belongs to Germany. Germany becomes its own country. You have the Czech Republic. You have Slovakia, which then merges to Czechoslovakia. You have Austria, Hungary. This is Romania. Bulgaria again. A new country called Yugoslavia. Yugo in this means pan or cross. So it's like the land of the Slavs, of all different type of Slavic peoples. Albania, Greece gets its independence again, but at that point it's already been independent from the Ottomans. You have a new country here called Turkey. Countries down here, what's called a mandate system, where England and France decide to break up the Middle East, create their own lines, and then administer them until they can get independence. And so this is the post-war world that's going to leave the Germans impoverished as they have to pay all these debts to France, England, and the other Italy for their victories in the United States, and that's going to wreck their economy. Additionally, they're going to start printing more and more money to pay back, which is going to wreck them even more. And it's going to put them in a bleak spot. But by doing all of this, what happens is this war-torn area takes a lot of resources to build back up. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Roaring 20s, we're going on a great time, really making our money. Wealth is coming in, but it's not for long. And that's going to lead us to the next major event that brings up the rise of dictatorships and fascism. But here we have the Soviet Union that comes about. And they have a civil war all the way to 1922, where the Red Army finally, 1922, becomes victorious finally as the Soviets take control. Even though they were supported by, or fought against by the White Army of the monarchy, supported by France, England, and the United States. So that's World War I in a quick overview or nutshell. So hopefully you followed along and filled things in. Oh, over here we got, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Now, a lot of these countries you're sitting here looking at and you're going, hey, wait a minute, these are some of the modern countries today. What we also don't realize is they're going to get swallowed up in World War II. Russia's going to take over, the Soviet Union. Americans calling the Soviet Union Russia is actually an insult. It's not acknowledging the Soviet Union as a whole. It's still like, we don't recognize you. Another example is, they were calling Istanbul Constantinople up until World War I. And by the end of World War I, they're like, fine, I guess it's Istanbul. That's 450 years later, so it's like, man, holding on to something. But these will be swallowed up in World War II between Germany and the Soviet Union. So anyway, this is the landscape. Notice we get the Republic of Ireland that comes out of this a little bit later. I think that's 1920, the Irish Free State. Then they go into civil war because of the North, and then finally emerge. Fun stuff there. But anyway, so there's World War I in a nutshell. All right. Thanks for watching. Laters.
You gotta fight for your right.